Hello and welcome to this BlenderCookie.com tutorial. My name is Kernon Dillon and this is part 3 of the Urban Stairway tutorial. In this part we're going to complete the modeling. So let's get started. Okay, here we are in Blender where we left off, and we're going to be starting with the 5-way connector and the 3-way connector. That's the 3-way, and here are the 5-way connectors. Okay, and before we get into that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping just to delete the caps on the remaining railing parts and add a Subsurf Modifier and set smooth. Okay, alright, and we're ready to begin working on the 5-way connector. Okay, the first thing we want to do is duplicate one of the railings, and I moved it to layer 3. And we're just going to scale it down and snap it to the 3D cursor, which is at the origin. And basically we want to make a T-connector. And we see that at the top we have a face and we want an edge at the top, so let's rotate the geometry 15 degrees around the x-axis. And I'm just going to scale it up a little bit. And in the top view, let's add 3 edge loops. And we want to use the shear tool, which is Control S, and we select the geometry as you can see, and turn on auto merge and snapping. And when you invoke the shear tool, just for the right side, set it to -1, and the right side set it to 1. And now let's delete the interfaces and select the loops that are surrounding the opening here, and extrude along the y-axis, and then scale along the y-axis to 0 to flatten them out. And let's select an edge on the other side, the other opening, because we want the opening that we just created to be the same length. And so we'll turn off auto merging, and we press the P key to separate that edge into a different object and snap it. And then we go into edit mode and select the geometry as seen and snap it to the end of that edge. And then delete that object that we created. And now let's delete the other half of everything, because we're going to be adding in a mirror modifier, and we want it to be at the top of the stack. And sometimes when you use the mirror modifier, it won't mirror as you expect, and you might have to select the object and press Control A to apply the scale and rotation. And that will reset the scaling and rotation. And now let's add a loop, and with auto merge turned on, slide it as you can see where it connects, and then delete the center vertex and apply the mirror modifier. And we want to use a tool in the edit buttons called ToSphere that will attempt to make a sphere of the selected geometry. But that's not quite working, so we take the innermost vertices and scale them out, and then we try ToSphere again, and that's good enough. And we want to extrude upward and then scale along the z-axis with a value of 1, and then ToSphere again, and then we want to extrude so we can form the dome shape that's at the top of the 5-way connector, and make some adjustments as needed. And we can see at the top we have groupings of 3 vertices, and that's really quite a bit. So with auto merge turned on, we can snap these to create 2 pairs of triangles, and we select the pairs and press the F key to convert them to faces, to quads. And we'll do the same thing in the corners between each of the openings. Okay. And now with this created, we want to simplify our work again, so we're going to delete the same 2 halves, the top and the side, and apply a mirror modifier so that we again only have to work in this one corner. And we want to add a loop on each opening to control the sharpness, and let's pull out the center vertex, as you can see, to smooth that out. We don't want it entirely sharp. again, taking a look at our reference. And we want to delete the bottom part and add the Z-axis in our mirror modifier interface. And now we want to create the actual thickness of the openings. And so we're going to select let's first apply the mirror modifier so we can select the entire loop. And when we press extrude, we want to scale holding the control key down until we see a value of 0.8 in the lower left-hand corner on the header bar. So extrude, scale with the control key to 0.8, then extrude inward, and then add a loop on the inside and the outside to control the sharpness. And I'm setting that to a value of 0.9 as I slide those loops holding down the control key. And you'll see the value of 0.9 in the lower left-hand corner of the 3D view. And we're on the bottom of our object here, and we delete these faces because now we want to extrude the bottom opening. And again, creating the same type of thickness that we did on the other parts, and add another loop at the bottom of that opening just to sharpen that up. And we'll just guesstimate the length. Okay. And now we just want to close up the top. All right. And that's pretty much it. I want to add another loop here just so we can get better control of that sharpness. And you can see the loop is not exactly straight. So let's select the loop and then scale along the appropriate axis and setting it to a value of 0 so that it flattens out. Okay. And that's it. Let's move it back to layer 1. Then we switch to layer 1. And we want to reset the center point of the object. And we'll copy location it to one of the railings and then position it accordingly, and then scale it up a little bit just so it looks like the railing is going into it. And I'm selecting both sides because I think I want that to be shorter, and I'm scaling, holding down the control key and noting the value that I did for those sides, and then just repeat that for the other sides. And that's it. We'll duplicate it with Shift D and then copy its location to those railings or to one of the railings, and then rotate it 90 degrees and adjust the position. Okay. And now we need to do the 3-way connector, and we'll just duplicate one of the 5-way connectors, position it, and then we'll modify it. Right, so we select it and go into the local view by pressing numpad / and select the inner ring of the appropriate opening to get the shape that we need, to have the 2 openings that we need, and use control numpad plus to increase the selection area. And then we just want to close up these openings, and we want to count the number of loops that we're going to need to connect to the other sides. And in this case, we'll need 3. And do the same thing on the other side. And now we want to pull this out just a little bit to help round it out. And now let's select all of the faces and press the W key and then select smooth, and we'll do that repeatedly just to give us a good head start on smoothing it out. Then we go into the sculpt mode and select the smooth brush and start smoothing it out. And it's looking kind of flat on the back, so let's use the inflate tool and just bring that out a little bit more, and then we'll smooth that down. Okay, and this doesn't need to be perfect. If it did, I would do it a different way, but this really won't be seen, but we still want to have it look pretty much like it needs to look. Okay, so we can see how that's coming out, and we see that we need to do it again on this side. So we select the inner loop, control numpad plus to increase the selection area, then close up the faces. And pull these out just a little bit. Okay, and then go into the face select mode and select those faces and then smooth those out repeatedly. And then go into sculpt mode and smooth that out. And this is good enough for what we need here. Okay. And that's it on the 5-way connector and the 3-way connector. Also, in the process of doing this, I noticed another omission. Actually, a couple. I'm going to go in and mark these as done. Okay. Let's do a quick render before we fix anything else, just so we can see where we are. Okay. It's coming along really good. We can zoom in and see our connectors. It turned out pretty well. Okay, let's work on the casing for the steps. And that's number 17. And we can see it in our reference image. And the opposite side is just barely visible, and we'll be sure to add that detail as well. And this seems like a simple object, and it is, but it can be kind of tricky to make sure you get it to look right. And we want to start by duplicating a face in one of the railings, the bottom face, and pressing the P key to separate it into its own object. And that way we don't have to worry about making it parallel to the railing. It will already be set up the way we want it. And we want to pay attention to the relationship of the different parts to the post and the landing area, and also how it sits relative to the railing that we added right there. So let's pull that over. Okay. And let's pull that up so we can account for that part that wraps around the post. And let's add a loop cut so we can have something to cut out, so we can have it actually go around and not just merely intersect the post. That will give us a better look. And I'm just trying to isolate the parts that we want to see, the railing, the post, and the part that we're modeling. Okay. All right. And I did it that way because we want a little bit of gap there, just again so we can get another little bit of detail in a shadow that we wouldn't be able to get if we just intersected this piece with the actual post at the top of the steps. And now we're deleting any unnecessary faces. And I think I'm going to extrude this down. That might help us when it comes to the lighting. Sometimes light can leak from other parts in the scene if you have too many faces deleted. Okay. And we also note that there's a recess section, so let's add a loop. And then extrude this face in, and then clean up the unnecessary faces. let's adjust the depth of that. And we want to bevel the edges as well. And that's it. Okay, the next thing we want to do is create the steps. Okay. And we're going to start with a cube and position it and scale it. And I'm going to scale it with Shift Y, excluding the Y-axis, so that we get scaling along the X and Z, and thereby maintaining the width of our cube. And I've selected the objects I want to isolate, so we can just work on these parts or work on the steps in this context. And just getting our dimensions the way we want them. And deleting the faces that we won't be needing, the back, the bottom, and the two sides. Okay. And let's bring in our background image just to get an idea of where we are. Even though we're not really aligned to this image, we can still look at the relative difference between our current geometry and our reference and make a decision about where we want to place the steps. We don't need to be totally accurate, but we do want it to look good. So now that we have the one, we add an array modifier and we set the relative offset for the z-axis to -1, and the x-axis is already set to 1 by default. And now we can adjust just the original geometry that we had, and of course the copies made with the array modifier will be adjusted at the same time. Okay, we can see that's not quite aligning, but I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to cheat and rotate this just a tiny bit, and that's good enough. And we want to turn on merge so that the copies actually connect to each other. And we select the top edge and use the bevel tool twice to get a nice turn for the top portion of the step. And then we want to add 2 loops and then select that face and extrude it in, or move it in actually. And that gives us a nice overhang. And then we select the bottom edge and use the bevel tool to round that out. And we can see that there's a gap between our copies, so let's just increase the limit parameter on the array modifier, and that will connect the copies. And that's it. Let's take another look. I see some things I need to adjust on the stair casing, but I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, and that's it for the steps. Okay, now we want to work on the transition plate between the floor and the steps. At least that's what I'm calling it. It's just something that's placed over the floor and the top of the stairs, just to make that transition smooth. And you can see the shadow there indicating that it's a separate piece. All right, and I think the simplest way to begin will be to use part of the steps, since it already has the shape that we want. But before we do that, I see we have that gap that I need to fix between the casing and the steps. So let's just bring this edge down. Okay. And let's just duplicate this object. And we can see because we duplicated it, it still has an array modifier attached to it. So let's just delete that from the copy. And we're left with a copy of the original object. And we position it. And I think I want to isolate it. I just have the floor selected and the plate that we're creating. and do some simple extrudes and translations. Okay. And we want to bring that down into the floor so we can have some sort of a transition, but we don't want it to go right into the floor. We want a little bit of a lip at the end, just like we would expect in the real world. Okay, and that's it for the transition plate. And here we have a render of where we are so far. Okay, and there's some things that I've missed. I want to go back and get those things. I need to just give a hint of the casing for the stairs on the other side. And we can also see that we're missing a railing that needs to extend all the way to the wall. There's two of them kind of hidden behind the post. But we'll finish this part first. And we'll just delete the geometry that we don't need. We just want to give the impression that the same thing is on this side closest to the camera. And we just delete most of it and just extrude and connect faces, connect edges, and pull that down and just get it into place. All right, and that's it. Now let's extend this railing to the wall. And then we'll duplicate all the parts for this support ring. And just as we did before, position that in place. And we'll delete our note and cross out the transition plate. And also, we can also see in the image that these columns go down all the way, but they're currently sharing the same object data. So we can go into the Edit Buttons window and press that number beside the object name and make it a single user. And then select both those objects again and make them share the same data just between those two. Earlier, all three of those posts on that side were sharing the same data. And then just pull it down like we see in our reference, and that's it. Okay. And you can see it's the tiny little details that really make the difference to make it look believable. All right. And at this point, we're done with all the geometry concerning the stairway. And now we want to work on the windows in the next section. Okay, let's begin making the window trim and header. And we switch to a camera view using numpad 0. Just so we can use our reference image to get some proportions. And we want to add a cube. And we want to get just some basic scaling and positioning done. And we move that up using snapping. And let's move this over just so we can get a better idea of how wide we need to make that. And let's add a loop across the center. And then extrude that face. And we notice that it's tapered a little bit on the outside. And it has two levels to it. So we have these two faces to work with. And we want to add controlling loops because we're going to be adding a Subsurf Modifier to this. And let's delete the top faces because we won't be seeing those. And we've got a Subsurf Modifier applied, and we're adjusting the controlling loops to control how we want the actual turn of the surface to go, how sharp or smooth we want it. And I'm selecting the vertices of the opening and snapping the cursor to that, and also centering the object to that, its origin, and then scaling along the x-axis a duplication of the first part, and also have the object data linked using Control L. And we add another cube. And just looking at our reference, we want to have another piece up here for the header. And we're snapping it to the outer trim there, but we're also moving it back a little bit because we want to have those tiny little gaps between things. Otherwise, it won't look like separate pieces. It'll just blend into looking like just one piece. And let's duplicate the header and then scale that up and in, because we notice in our image there's another piece of framing at the top. And now let's work on the window sill. We'll duplicate that piece we just created. And we can see in our reference there looks to be another bit of detail, so we'll just duplicate that piece again and just have that in there just for some extra added detail. Okay, and just getting our proportions in place, and we want to push that bottom edge in and then extrude that bottom face and scale it just so we can have a little bit more interesting shape. And I decided to undo that. We'll do it a different way. And we're adding controlling loops because we know we're going to be adding a subsurf modifier. And the same thing for this piece. And I want to duplicate the top part and delete the faces that are going to be hidden. And do the same thing for the top part and the bottom. And I don't think we need, well, let's shape it a little bit first. I'm selecting the vertices at the top on each end and then scaling them outward so we get a little bit better shape. And then we position everything. And I realize now we're not going to need these top faces. And the same thing for this piece. Okay. All right. And now we can see we have a gap between the pieces that we put in place in the sill, but that's good because we can extrude down and taper that in, and that gives us a nice shadow underneath, so we don't have our objects just merely intersecting. It gives the appearance of it them being separate pieces that have been constructed. Okay. And that's a little bit too much of a gap here, so let's work on that a little bit. All right. Just looking around, and I think I want to shape this a little bit more. And now let's work on our corners. We want to select the edges that can be seen and just bevel them. We don't need to do all of them, just the ones that will be visible. Okay. Delete those faces. And I'm just going to scale this entire face, extrude it, and then scale it to get a bevel all the way around. And there are a lot of different pieces here. I just wanted, I'm not trying to get the actual construction to be accurate as it would be, you know, in a real window, but we just want to give the impression. And so we want some vertical details here to give the impression that there's an actual window here. And so we're just adding some little pieces here to give the impression that there's a track that the windows will slide in. And now we want to do the framing for the window, or the actual window sash. And I'm just duplicating the geometry for this opening and then scaling it. And then select all the vertices and extrude those vertices inward and adjust them. And we know we need 2 of these. And so I thought I was going to be slick and just move that up and copy it, but it's not working like I want it to. So we'll just undo that and just delete those 2 vertices. But we still need it to be the height of half of the height of the opening. So I'm going to add a loop to this side piece that we know is the height of the opening, and then just snap that sash to that loop and then delete that loop afterwards in the framing piece. So we just temporarily created that loop so we could snap to it and then delete it afterwards. And duplicate the top sash, position it, and I'm going to cheat a little bit again because it's not lining up the way I want, and we're not trying to be so accurate with this. We just want to give the impression. Okay, and that's the window sashes and the window jamb. And this is the window stop that keeps, I'm not a window expert, but I guess it just keeps the window sash from falling in. And now these pieces were on a different layer, and they're from the cutout that we did at the very beginning for these window openings. And remember, we decided to keep those pieces. And so we're just going to position them and scale them and use them as the actual glass for the window. All right. And that's it for the window. We just need to duplicate it. And I was going to try to snap it over here. Trying to be slick again, add a loop and then snap to it, but it didn't work because I didn't reset the center point. And you can see that it's off center there in the header. So we'll just eyeball it, and that's good enough. All right, and that's it for the windows. I just want to take the planes that we're using for the glass and just give it a temporary texture with some transparency. And that's it. Okay, now we want to do the baseboard heater and its cover. So let's take a look at that in our reference. Okay. And we will start by going to layer 3. And we're just going to add a plane. I turn the grid floor back on. I'm going to rotate the plane around the x-axis 90 degrees. And we just want to model the profile of each component of this first before we start extruding. And that way we can establish the relationships and determine the size of things. And I think it's much easier this way. And you can extrude vertices by simply control left clicking. And I duplicated one vertex in the piece at the top and separated it with the P key to create another separate object. And this part I'm working on now is the corner cover that covers the controls for the baseboard heater. And it has crimps in it so that you can actually pull it out and expose the controls. And I just finished doing the cover plate. And this will serve as the little slats that we see. I'll just do 2 since that's all you can see. I am just tweaking things. And this will be the base of the heater. And we notice that there are some vertical sections. And so we'll create those, add some loop cuts, turn on proportional editing, and then shape that. Okay. All right, now we've got our parts in place. Let's start scaling them. We'll extrude that a little bit to give it some thickness. Let's shape the base and then stretch it out. And these are the 2 slats that we have. And this piece is the vertical slats that we have. Let's pull out the cover, the top cover, and that's the front cover. And this is the control cover. And we just want to establish the positions of everything. And this part here, this vertical part, we're going to use an array modifier. And I'm just going to guess that there may be like 10 of them that go across along the y-axis. And at this point, we're basically just positioning things, stretching them out. And this side, I just duplicated the cover on the left side, but we need to take some of the edge loops out because this side is a more solid piece. It's not designed to come off like the other side is. All right. And we're just tightening up the positioning of everything. Okay. Now we'll start smoothing and controlling the edges to help define what the material is supposed to be like. This is going to be sheet metal that's been crafted to be a baseboard heater, so we know the folds need to be pretty sharp and distinct. And we're going to add a little bit of thickness to it, and some controlling loops so that when we add our subsurf modifier, things don't round out too much. And we want to position this because it's not perfectly seated. Okay, and let's add a control loop to control this corner. All right. And edge loops so we can control the sharpness of the folds in the metal. And I'm adding some beveling to some of the parts. And not all of the faces, just the ones that you can see. And I'm adding 2 bevels there just so we get a nice turn on that surface. And we want to be aware of any faces that we can delete that won't be seen. Okay. And we'll delete these faces on the bottom and on this side. And we'll adjust some more of the positions. And I initially was going to have this be extruded to have some thickness, but I think it's more trouble than it's worth because it's the angle that it's at. I don't think you're really going to notice the thickness anyway. So we'll just make it a single flat surface that's been shaped. And now we bring our object from layer 3 to layer 1 where everything else is and position it, scale it a little bit if we need to. Just looking at the reference image, we're not trying to get it exactly the same, but close enough. And the cover, I've duplicated it, and we're going to use this to create, there's another piece on the floor that looks like it's broken off or something. And I won't model it exactly like it is, but we'll just take this cover and add some extra loops so we can twist it and bend it how we want, just to make it look a little bit damaged. And then we want to place it on the floor so it appears natural, like it's resting on the floor and against the wall a little bit. And that's it. And we do a quick render. This is with approximate ambient occlusion. I'll do one later at the end using normal ambient occlusion. Okay. All right, so we're pretty much done with all of the objects. I just want to tweak some things here. I think I want to bring this down a little bit more, this piece underneath the windowsill, and I just linked the geometry with Control L, so I can just change one of them and they'll both change. Okay. And also we need to change the position of this railing that we put on the other side of the steps with the decorative supports. I never did really position it. And we want to borrow our widget transformation that we did, our custom orientation, and use that so we can move it up and down along the railing. All right. And we're almost done. And we can see some shading artifacts there, but we'll fix that later. And that's it. Just a couple more things I want to look at. For example, here, that doesn't make sense to just intersect, so we want to add some welding right there. Okay, we want to make some final changes here. Really just one thing, and that is the welding on these, between these two rail parts. And I'm in a local view with just these two objects selected. And I'm going to duplicate the edge loop and then press the P key to isolate it to a separate object and create some sort of a torus shape, just enough to make it appear to be closed. And we want to position it around the rail and then go into sculpt mode and using the grab and smoothing tools, just shape it so that it appears to be a welded joint. It's very simple, but it adds another little detail of realism that can go a long way. All right, and here's another approximate ambient occlusion render. We can see our welding. Okay. And that's it. I know this has been a long trek to get through all of this, but I wanted to show all of the process of doing this. And in the next part, we're going to take a look at the actual details, some of the technical details. And here's the original reference image. And here's our render result. And I think that's pretty good considering we didn't get great camera alignment in the beginning. And as I mentioned, in the next part, we're going to take a look at, do a technical overview or review of the techniques demonstrated, some of the more involved techniques and demonstrated in this second and third parts of the series. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.